Today is our last seminar with respect to international development. The speaker is Dr. Hale Tufan. I just want to remind the students who are taking the class that next week is our last discussion. Some of you need to up your discussion attendance. Make sure you get a time with you. All right, so Hallie is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Plant Breeding and Genetics at the School School. She's the project manager of Next Gen Cassava project, and specifically interested in gender responsive Cassava breeding initiative. She has worked as an assistant tutor with CIMMIT, the National Center for Medium Wheat Research, in winter wheat improvement project in Turkey. Turkish ancestry. She also worked at the School of International Development, the University of East Anglia in the UK, which she also got her PhD. Her main focus is on designing gender responsive crop breeding programs, trying to understand what crop traits farmers, utilizers of crops are interested in, what their preferences are. And then lastly, she's the PI principal investigator of the Lake Project, which is the gender responsive researchers equipped agriculture. Okay. I'm sorry.
The disclaimer of allergies.
So I'll read to you.
Hello, everyone. So, thank you, Julie, for the introduction. I don't think I need to say much more about that, but today, I think I'm working on mainly on two things that they intersect at this point of how do you integrate gender into breeding. I'll talk about why that's important and how.
Try that again. So I'll start with a little bit of terminology because I think it's really important to understand what we mean by gender and what does that mean for agricultural research. There's a lot of ambiguity there. Why gender in development, especially agricultural research? Gender in breeding specifically, kind of narrowing down, and then some experiences on gender training for ag researchers. So all gender trainings start with this exact slide, so I figured why not. Can anyone kind of tell me off the top of their head what they think the difference between sex and gender is? What does sex mean in definition, and what does gender mean, and how are those different? Any ideas? There's no, male, female, exactly. So the male, female would fit where? Sex, exactly. So sex really is defined as the biologically defined and genetically acquired differences between males and females. So what it means to be a male or a female. And the definition is the same around the world. There's no cultural contextual element to being a male or a female. It's defined on genetic factors and biological factors that can be physiological or genetic or hormonal. Gender, on the other hand, is completely socially defined. So what it means to be a man or a woman. Right? This is one step different than being a male or a female. And there's a very heavy sociocultural dimension to this. So what it means to be a man or a woman is very different from place to place, but even over time. What it meant to be a woman in the 1950s in the US is very different than what it means to be a woman right now, right? So there's a longitudinal element and a geographical element that changes. So that's really kind of important to understand because these are not static definitions. Sex is static, but gender is changing. So we need to keep abreast with those changes and understand them and integrate them into our work as possible. a few other definitions. So gender roles are really what are ascribed to men and women on what they should be doing, their behaviors, their tasks, their responsibilities. And that again changes over time, but that's what we define as gender roles. What should you be doing as a woman or a man? And what is the appropriate behavior that's ascribed to that? And gender relations, and this is a key part of gender research, is gender is a relational concept. So it's a relationship between a man and a woman, but it's also a relationship intergenerationally. So an older woman has a very different role, responsibility, and position in society than a younger woman does, for example. So that's a relational concept, right? It's defined, your status is defined in relation to someone else. And that's called gender relations broadly. And kind of narrowing down, gender responsive research is what we're talking about today, is how you integrate these understandings into research and really understand the context of the communities and people that you're working with and how to respond to that when you're designing your research. Okay, this is another mini quiz. You may hear gender equity, gender equality, and those are often used interchangeably. People say gender equity, gender equality. Does anyone know if there is a difference or what that difference could be? Again, no right or wrong answers, but if you've heard of anything or if you have an idea. It's even confusing in the community, so it's not that straightforward. So I love this graphic, and it's overused nowadays, but you know, baseball game, there are 3 kids trying to watch it. Gender equality in definition is giving everyone the same chance to succeed, right? In this case, you have 3 people with differing heights. You give them exactly the same box. They all stand on the box. But the height, the person who's shorter still can't see the game, right? So even though you've given everyone the same chance, the outcome is still different. And that's because there's a historical disadvantage, or there's a reason that that same treatment still doesn't, you know, have an outcome of everyone having the same chance in life. So that's what we call gender equality. You give everyone the same chance, opportunities, you know, the same box. Gender equity is when you're more intentional. So you know that this person has a height challenge. So you give them 2 boxes rather than 1. So you make sure the outcome is equal rather than the input, right? So here, this person doesn't get a boost. This person gets a little boost. This person gets a larger boost. And this one, which is kind of a play on this as well, when you talk about gender transformation, which you may or may not have heard of in agriculture especially, is when you just get rid of the fence. You know, here we're dealing with a fence and we keep trying to get over this fence, but if we really want to change the status of women and young people in society and development, we have to get rid of the fence. I mean, in any society, even in our society, there are still issues. So that's what we call gender transformation, is you just get rid of the fence. So everyone can just do whatever they want. And I have someone who has a play on this where they turn this kid around and say, a further step to that is you don't expect the boy necessarily to be watching the football, right? You challenge the norms. You start saying, I challenge what it means to be a man or a woman in society. So these are kind of concepts that you may or may not run into depending on your interest in the subject, but are used often interchangeably, and there is a difference, and it's important to understand that, I think. So base concepts, you know, summarizing all of gender studies in 3 slides. What does that all mean for agricultural research specifically, which is what we're interested in? And why does it matter? There's some numbers. People like numbers. You can look at this in a quantitative or qualitative manner, but numbers have an impact. Women have access to only 5% of extension services. So if you think of extension as being knowledge being distributed to women who are farmers, especially, only 5% of women have access to that knowledge. That's already a huge disadvantage because they're not getting access to the latest thinking, crop management practices, varieties, innovations. So they're kind of in the dark with what's going on. There are many different reasons for that, but let's take that as a number. And one of the reasons is that extension agents are by and large men. And in kind of more conservative societies, a man coming into the community and just talking to women is not often very accepted, right? So unless you have women extension agents, it's hard to get to the women, and there's a lot of barriers around that. So if you only have 50% of extension agents being women, that means you're not able to get that far. Sure. Sorry?
What is the number for me?
That's men and women distribution, so 9, 5, and 5. Yeah. So 10% of all investments in agriculture are targeted at women. So generally they're agnostic, quote unquote, right? They just assume that everyone has equal benefits. 10% of those specifically target women, which I think is low, because if you think 50-50, it should be closer to 50, if you're really being intentional. More numbers, land holding is a huge issue. If you think, you care about the land that you're growing your crop on. So if you don't own that land, or if it's kind of insecure, the likelihood of you putting a lot of effort into that land and getting more out of it is lower. And by and large, across the globe, women own a very small minority of land. So this is land titling. Well, what's on the name of the title of the land? There are various interpretations of land holding, so we won't go into that detail. But if you look across the board, often titles do not belong to women, and that's problematic in itself. So seeing that there's kind of a resource gap. Women don't have access to the same resources in terms of physical resources, but also knowledge resources. Why does that matter? So FAO does a lot of number crunching, and they came up with some of these projections saying that the yield gap between farms managed by men and women, not owned, but managed by men and women, have a 20-30% difference in productivity. And if you were to kind of change that and increase women's productivity to equal that of men's, whether that's what you want to do or not, you can bring out 100 to 150 million people out of poverty. So just by addressing that discrepancy, you can have a big impact. That's it. So that's why we care. There's a lot of other reasons why we care, what I'll get into, but those are the numbers. Another well-known fact, I would say, is that women often spend more on the family and nutrition and care for their family than men when you break down the numbers. This is being a little unfair and generalizing men in a bad way, and I don't mean to do that. But when you look at where the income goes to, men often reinvest, for example, in something else, but they won't spend as much in the household for children's health. And that has a huge impact for the family. So, you know, that's another good thing if we're thinking of food security and increasing, you know, improving lives. So how do we understand what's going on in a community and really start addressing those issues? Where do we start? Well, this is what we call gender analysis. Really, in short, it highlights the difference between and among women, men, girls, boys. So another really important factor is gender is not just women. And it's not just a difference between men and women, what we call cross-sectionality. So marital status, ethnicity, age, religion, these can all have a confounding factor on just being a man or a woman, right? So within a group, a wealthy woman will have much more power than a poor man within the same community. Even though you would think, oh, the man's more empowered, that's not always true. So it's a very complex phenomenon. So you have to look at all the variables. In a good study that looks at gender, you look at all the different variables and you question each of those. So you look at their distribution of resources, opportunities, priorities, power dynamics. How can people really achieve their potential and their agency and really live their lives to their fullest potential? So you do that through gender analysis more broadly. And so once we know what we know, why does that matter? Because in agricultural research, there are two main rationales. And I like to call one the effectiveness and then the other one social justice argument. There are two different arguments for why you should care. One is if you address gender issues and really target women, it was that FAO stat, you can really increase effectiveness. More adoption, more productivity, whatever's problematic within those definitions, but that's the goal, increasing productivity. But the social justice argument is it's the right thing to do. You know, that these are complex issues that have negative consequences on people's lives and we should care about them. And together, if we're talking about research for development, both of those arguments are valid. Whatever your entry point, you should be looking at both, ideally. So gender analysis can come up with a lot of different issues that you could be looking at, but one is, I think it's an interesting exercise, gender-based constraints. So what does this mean? It's a restriction on men's or women's access to resources or opportunities based on their roles or positions in society. So it's the disparities, but also identifying why those disparities exist. So why does being a woman or being a man specifically in a community mean you have a specific shortcoming or a constraint? So, for example, you did your gender analysis of wherever you're working and you find that generally for smallholder farmers, landholding size is an issue. Limited finance or credit options affect everyone. You don't have access to market information, so you can't really sell your produce in an effective way. And productivity is overall low due to lack of access or control of resources. So can anyone think of what a gender-based constraint either for these or something that related to those could be, just looking at those?
Regarding lack of access to market information, maybe the inability to travel outside home.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So women are often less mobile, so they don't have access to the networks to get the market information. Thus, they're disadvantaged. It's a gender-based constraint. Any other ideas?
Well, if women don't have access to government titles,
Exactly. So, and that again is not specific to women. Some women may have, but maybe a younger woman has absolutely no ability, right, to get a loan because they don't even exist in the system very officially. Please.
Because of small land holdings in some areas, being able to does have the title to land, they're more likely to encroach on that land. Situations.
Absolutely. So it could look like you own the land, but in practice it could be very different. You could have in-laws or your family could be running the land. In theory you hold it, but maybe your sons are actually determining the decisions on that land. So again, that's based on your gender that you're being constrained in that way. So again, yes, probably you gave better examples than I had here, but laws or customs that restrict women's land ownership or access and control of that land, whether it's on paper or in practice. Bank policies still require a signatory, the husband or the son or whatever. I was in Australia for a recent meeting, and until 1997 in Australia, a woman could not get credit alone. Isn't that shocking? I just could not believe that. So this is not like it's only in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a huge issue worldwide. It's changing, but it's still the remnants of very old, archaic policies. Exactly like you said, social norms restrict women's networking abilities. That's a pretty generalizable finding, I would say. This is not true everywhere, but by and large, it is a restriction that comes up over and over again. And often, you know, this concept of a unitary household, you may or may not heard of this, that a household is a unit and everyone decides together, and what happens within that household is, you know, you shouldn't look at it, or you should. There's a lot of debate around that. But often what happens is, even if there's money coming in and money going out, or resources coming in and out, what happens in between is really important. And often that's very unequal. You know, who has decision-making power over what happens to your income is where the power dynamics within the household play out. So we keep going narrower and narrower. What does this have to do with plant breeding? You know, gender issues. It's a really social issue. You talk to breeders and they go, I don't know what you're talking about. It's not my job. I just breed varieties of whatever I'm breeding. So does it matter for plant breeding? That's the question that I often ask in my work. By definition, plant breeding is a genetic improvement in plants for human benefit. Right? It's a very selfish activity. We take plants and we do what we do with them to make them better in terms of what we want out of them. I love this example. This is a wild mustard plant, and all of these things here come from one wild mustard plant, and they're defined as strains. They're not even different species. They're literally breeding. Breeders took a wild mustard plant and made all of that out of it. So that's the power of plant breeding. You can really make changes, and whether short or long term. So what does gender have to do with plant breeding? New varieties are really the output of breeding programs. That's the main kind of outcome of breeding is developing new varieties. When you talk to breeders, often, and this is again very unfair to a lot of breeders, but this is what you hear a lot, varieties are gender neutral. It's just a plant. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with what you're talking about. The benefits are for everyone. I care about everyone. I'm just breeding the best possible plant that I can. You know, why are you blaming me? Farm households function as a unit. I give the variety to the household, and what happens, happens, but they all benefit, right? And we can't breed varieties for women. It's come back. It's too specific. It can't be done. So these are generally the arguments that come back. But what I like to say is, well, breeding is inherently market driven. If the people that are going to grow your variety don't like it, they will not grow it. So if you really want to breed the best possible variety, you should understand your end users. And part of that is gender, right? Because people have very different interactions with the crop. They have different roles in the production cycle, processing cycle. So what they care about individually will have an impact in if they decide to grow or eat it, right? And the social justice, this is the kind of efficiency argument. You should understand your client to make something better for them. And the social justice argument, if you really want to benefit everyone, these are huge issues that have an impact on how your work reaches people and what the impacts that you can have. And by and large, it's really about priority setting. And that's true for a lot of different development interventions. Who decides what gets done and why? And for breeding, most breeding programs define their objectives through expert input. That means breeders talking to breeders. They'll decide, well, this seems to be important. I'm talking to farmers, and I really think this is what we should be breeding for. And this is a review that was recently done by actually looking at breeding systems. And they found that it's mostly just people talking to in their own networks. So not really engaging with the people they should be. And there's a long historical reason for why that is, especially for plant breeding. There's a disconnect between the research and the communities, right? And this is not getting better with time, I have to say. Geography versus demography. I think that really summarizes breeders breed for geography. They breed for environments. They don't breed for demography. They don't have people in mind. They have environments in mind. Again, it's disconnect, saying I'm a neutral party in this. I'm just breeding the best possible plant. But there's some more refined thinking that says a targeted environment should really be defined as a natural and a socioeconomic factor, right? An environment should be the people and the place together. So there's some thinking along that line. From a more breeder's perspective, if you come back with a breeder with a set of 50 different traits and say, this is what people want, they'll just say, whew, I can only do 3 of those. I can't handle that. So it's also kind of a technological or a technical question of how many traits you can care about. So often what happens is breeding programs will say, well, I'll breed for resistance and yield, and everybody likes resistance and yield. What can go wrong with that? So they reduce things down to common denominator traits that they think will impact everyone. So that can be fine overall, but what we really need to be careful of, we can go in one direction where we're actually increasing the benefits, especially for women and young people and maybe minorities, or we could be going the other way. And there are examples of this where plant breeders have developed varieties that will actually harm women because it takes longer to do something with that. There's a maize example, for example. It's so hard to pound that women were spending more time trying to actually pound it. So that's a penalty on women. And yet the decision to grow it could be made by the household head, which is a man, so they're not considering the impacts, right? This is definitely what we don't want to do. At the minimum, you want to not do any harm. In the best case scenario, you want to actually impact positively. And so how do we have gender intentional priority setting? Basically, we need to know the divisions of labor and market access and all the gender issues that can have an impact on how those individuals interact with the crop. We need to understand those, first of all. And it's a political decision because at the end of the day, a breeding program decides who controls what varieties being bred, who determines what qualities are valued. Those are political decisions sometimes. So that's a hard thing to change. But if you start asking the right questions, you may get there. And careful diagnosis with gender analysis. And this is what we always talk to the breeding programs about. So basically what we want is genetic gains, which means how much your plant has improved genetically to really translate into equity gains. So you also want that to translate into betterment and people's conditions, especially for women. So again, going to little weeds here a little bit, the breeding cycle. I don't know how many of you have any interaction with plant breeding, but generally this is what a breeding cycle looks like. You say, here's what I'm going to breed for. You set your priorities. You look at your germplasm available. Either that could be wild or cultivated. You see what's out there that I can actually use to meet this, or I generate new variability by making crosses. I select what I want within that. I test it either on station or on farm, and I can release that eventually. And that feeds into seed systems, which is a whole nother set of gender issues that we could have a whole session on. But by and large, that's a generic, very generic crop breeding cycle. There's an initiative called the Gender Breeding Initiative that I'm involved in. That's the CG. It's within the CG. It's a lot of, does everybody know what the CG, have you guys? So this is the consultative group for international agriculture research. It's kind of the mega international ag research bodies. they run a lot of the crop improvement globally. They produce a lot of the new germplasm. They're very heavily funded. They're international. They're all over the world. Anyway, just to say, they drive a lot of crop improvement, I would say, globally. So breeders and gender researchers from within that system, we came together and we looked across the breeding cycle to see what are the points where gender issues could come to play. The first one is, as you're defining your priorities, you're in essence saying, who am I going to breed for? So that social targeting step. Who are the potential customers, and is gender considered in that? When you're sampling, when you're saying who I'm going to test this with, who am I specifically going to target, what are you considering? Are gender differences or gender equality considered? So the orange diamonds are key stages in the breeding program, and the question or the decision to be made is in yellow and the outcome is in green. So we keep doing that. Which traits am I going to breed for when I'm evaluating? What is the market segment that I'm looking at? What are the traits and how am I relatively valuing them? How am I generating genetic diversity? How am I selecting them? So on and so forth. If you want more, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but if you just Google Gender Breeding Initiative, there's not a lot out there except for this. So you should find the whole website. They have a bunch of resources on this too. Just to say that there's more systematic thinking going on around this that's very new, which is exciting. So we came up with a review and what can a breeding program do to be gender responsive? Know when, where, and why women are important beneficiary group. That won't always be true, but when it's true, know that, because then you can act on it. Anticipate how design decisions can be influenced by women and influence women in turn, right? Those are two different things. You need to understand both. Design breeding objectives specifically to benefit women and disadvantaged farmers. Be intentional. Don't just do no harm, but actually try to benefit. And be accountable. Don't just put your arms up and say, oh, we tried, and then move on, right? Just try to measure, try to track what are your actual benefits. And this I love to show to breeders because often when you talk to breeders, like, again, they'll say, what I do has nothing to do with social change, right? And we had a case study collection, and there are 3 examples which I love because in the first, and this is in China with maize farmers, just engaging women as in participatory breeding programs. That's it. They literally decided to work with women. Simple decision for a breeding program. That in itself, over time, improved women's capacity to deliberate about choices of action, experiment with options, create new practices, and enlarge their network. By and large, it had a positive impact on their lives just by being a part of that program. That's not trivial. And as a breeder, you make that decision to include them or not, so that you have the power to do that. And the second one, and this is for sorghum in Mali, they looked at what traits were preferred or prioritized by the breeding program, and they looked and said if they were including women's preferred varieties for seed production, so they decided to multiply seeds that women preferred more than men, they were empowered to really become a part of that enterprise. So they started becoming seed producers. They started making money out of that. They started getting into the networks. Again, a net positive impact just by the breeding program making that decision on what to multiply. And the last one is for barley in Syria. And Syria is a very culturally conservative and hard place to work, that bringing the women out of the woodwork a little bit and engaging them in a very culturally sensitive manner, they could see that women were now recognized as farmers, whereas before they wouldn't even be considered farmers. They're just your wife, you know, they're just labor, or whatever, however it's defined. There's a lot of questions around labor and women. So can gender research help set breeding priorities? I have 2 cases to show that I think they can. One is, again, back to this example of sorghum in Mali. Through years and years of really good research, I would say, they found out 3 key factors about women sorghum farmers in Mali. One was they empirically showed that women, by and large, had lower fertility fields. There were significant differences in phosphorus content on women's plots compared to men's plots. That's huge because it has an impact on what your sorghum does on that field. Socioeconomic, women had a particular sub-variety of sorghum that they retained and grew that they thought was good for children's food security. And I think it did have higher iron content, for example. So they were retaining a land race and not an improved variety for a particular function. And when you ask them about what they cared about, they really, these quality requirements for threshing, storage, and food were not prioritized in the breeding program, but they were huge for women because they were doing those roles. They were the ones doing the threshing and the processing. So they didn't just put up their hands and go, oh, well, see, what can we do? But they actually changed the breeding program, which is awesome, I think. They developed new methodology to evaluate culinary preferences and processing qualities and included that in their breeding program. They actually went to women's fields and evaluated the varieties on women's fields. They started selecting under low fertility conditions because they knew a variety that did well under low fertility would probably impact women positively. And they focused on this type of sorghum that was retained by women for improvement. A second case, and this is the work I'm more directly involved in, is cassava in Nigeria. And this is just to show you, this was kind of a meta-analysis using big data, that if you look at households that grow cassava, which are the dots, green ones, they don't grow cassava, the other 3 colors they do. And the management of the plot in blue is male, red is female, and yellow is both. And it's overlaid with poverty levels. So the more red, the worse. So if you look at across the map of Nigeria, we work in the southwest and the southeast, you see kind of a different picture, right? The southwest is by and large a little wealthier, and there's more joint or male-headed plot management. In the southeast, you see women are actually managing their own plots, and there's higher poverty levels. So even though you could say, I'm going to breed cassava for Nigeria, those are very different conditions that cassava is growing in. So we tried to understand, okay, what does that mean? We did more qualitative work knowing that knowledge. And anyway, it's a publication, you can look into depth, but overall household use. Now this is a really tricky question. You'll ask people, what do you do with your crop X? Do you eat it or do you sell it? It's always a mix. It's never exclusive. Yet this always comes up in all the surveys ever done. Do you eat it or do you sell it? So we asked more kind of qualitatively, how much of it, where does it go, so on and so forth. And what you see is the regional differences really come out. If we didn't look at the regional differences, if we just looked at overall, we would say, oh, men definitely sell fresh and women process and sell, and home consumption is more important for men. But then when we look at the regions, that's significant. The significance is usual, kind of more stars, more significant. If you look at just in the Southwest, that's a huge difference. In the Southeast, there's no difference. So if we aggregate all of that into one data set, we miss the bigger picture. We miss the nuances in the region, for example. And we can keep looking at these. We had differences in traits that were coming up. Those were regionally very different. So again, we can say women care more about that, men care more about that. That doesn't hold across the areas. And women, by and large, dominate cassava processing, and they have input into labor. And we also saw religion was a big confounding factor as well. So it was really interesting that it's not as simple as you think. You can't generalize so easily. So cassava is often defined as a woman's crop. And what we found is in the Southeast, historically, there's a culture for women to be very active in cassava production and processing. They're called cassava queens, and the men are called yam kings. There's this kind of different historical trajectory that happened in the Southeast. And that really follows with the role of women in that area in cassava production. And we already know through prior work that trait preferences can be linked to livelihoods. This is a really interesting paper, I think probably my favorite paper ever, called The Importance of Being Bitter. And it looks at how cassava types that are grown in Malawi, bitter cassava was only retained by women widows. And they found this going, why would people retain, bitter cassava is cyanogenic, which means it's poisonous unless you properly kind of process it, right? It's not a good thing. No cassava breeding program retains bitter varieties because it's a health hazard. And yet these women were retaining these very high cyanogenic bitter varieties. And they found that because in times of conflict and war, widows' lands were often just raided. They had no rights over the cassavas, and they had no protection. Socially, they were not protected. So in order for people not to steal their cassava, they retained bitter cassava because they knew no one would steal that. So it's really interesting, and we have to think of these things really in depth and understand why that decision is made. And in purging the breeding programs of bitterness, are we actually doing these women injustice? Are we actually meaning that they can't get better varieties even if they want to? Anyway, so we saw that a similar trend that defined depending on where you are in your region and your religion and your marital status, you get very different sets of prioritization, which is very difficult for breeding programs to get their head around. Because then they're going to say, well, do you want me to breed for each region or what? So we're doing a little bit of work in trying to aggregate that to a scale that it makes sense. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit. So just quickly, overall, what we're doing in NextGen, we're looking at these descriptors, and we're moving into kind of trying to get that breeding link. How can you actually breed for this? I'm not going to spend too much time here, but there are market analysis tools that we're using cautiously and in conjunction with more qualitative work and understanding who we're talking to, where you can start getting typologies. Instead of saying men and women, you ask everyone everything, you get really in-depth individual information, and you look at what sets of traits emerge. So here are 3 types. For example, this group of farmers care about these set of traits and this priority. And it's almost like a pattern that emerges. And then what you do is you look and see who's in this group. If you have an overrepresentation of women or overrepresentation of a certain other social group that may have, maybe have a reason for doing that, you can start saying, if you're a breeding program and you want to impact this group of people, this is the typology you should be targeting. So we're making that link between actionable breeding and understanding the communities. And there's a really cool, if any of you are interested in participatory plant breeding or on-farm trials, this is a new method, or relatively new, about 5-6 years old, and they just published in PNAS, Van Etten et al., called TriCop. What they do is they work with tens of thousands of farmers, not just hundreds or tens. And they randomize varieties across. So instead of every farmer getting a same set of varieties, they send small bundles to everyone and averages out over the geography. So the error kind of averages itself out over 40, 50 replications. Anyway, it's a new way of doing on-farm trials. And there as well, you can get a massive amount of information from a lot of different farmers. And if you know who they are, then you can start saying, well, in this area, maybe this variety is prioritized more by this social group. You can start really defining it better, right? Being really intentional about this. Okay, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to breeze through the next slides. So another part of what I do is gender training, because what we find is, like I said, interacting with breeding programs, a lot of the time, there's not a lot of understanding about these issues and the importance thereof. So I lead a program called GREAT. It's a joint program with Makerere University in Uganda and Cornell. We started in 2016. It's Gates Foundation funded, so we're coming kind of towards the end. What we do is we have, again, this inclusive and effective. So both social justice and effectiveness argument. We really care about gender issues in ag research and what we can do about those. And it's sub-Saharan Africa focused. What do we do differently? Training, gender training is not the most exciting thing in the world, but it can have a big impact. So we try to do things a little bit differently. We work with working professionals, plant breeders who are actually out in the field, not students. So they're doing the work directly. So if we change them, we can change the system a little more quickly, I hope. So we give very practical training. What are the tools they can use? And we train them in teams. So a biophysical scientist is your breeder, your agronomist, your crop manager. A social scientist is your anthropologist, your socioeconomist. So they have to come together and they have to agree on something, which in itself is a huge undertaking. People don't like to think outside of their boxes. And we kind of have a theory session, practical application, and analysis. This is kind of our roadmap. They learn the basics, I would say, briefly. They get grants to go out into the field and apply what they've learned, and then they come back and interpret it and understand it. So the thing is here, they have to work together as a team. You force them to work together as a team, and we do force them to work together as a team, because usually a social scientist is doing their own thing, the breeder's doing their own thing, and they never actually talk. So in making them make these decisions together, you kind of, what we see by and large is the outcomes are they change attitudes and practice, because they understand, wow, social science is not so wishy-washy. It does have a benefit for me. Usually that's the feedback we get. And they often say, I always interact with farmers, but I had no idea what I was doing until now. I really understood that there are huge issues at hand here, right? They're really happy with the model, so that's something we're testing. Does it work to have the sandwich program where you come, you go away, and you come back? And that worked quite well. And they're actually changing their outputs. So they're writing new proposals, new papers, and presenting this. And that's when you get a system change, because it's the research ecosystem itself is changing. You're getting more gender in it. And I love this quote. This is one of our favorite fellows. He's with Biodiversity International, and he says, as an entomologist, I'd be biased towards control the insect and the problem is solved. Or bring new material and the problem is solved. Easy. Kind of positivist, usual, just bring your intervention, you're done. But now it's becoming more and more clear that I have to also withdraw from entomology, enter the household, and imagine that I'm making decisions with them. So really understand them. And then try to respond back with my recommendations and see which one of them. So this is the kind of change you want to see, right? They're thinking more than just the entomology, but actually the household. So I'm going to wrap up there so we have a little bit of time for questions. So if you want to know more in any form, we have an aware mailing list. Some of you may or may not be on it, but this is really focused on gender and agriculture in campus and beyond. So you can sign up for the newsletter. Devin's here. I'm here if you want to talk to us. And we're also organizing what we're calling Clinic on Gender Responsive Ag Research, Friday, the 17th of May, 9 to 1100 Man Library. It's kind of open to all. If you have any questions, issues, you're writing a proposal, you're writing a paper, or you're just curious, you can stop by for that period. So that's another opportunity. And we'll end with that. Thank you.
So is there like the like reading and like helping out like within the agriculture program? And it seems like sort of reading is more of an equity approach, whereas like is there like a state advanced check and then compared to like say increasing like market access or like increasing access to credit, or is there like a reason specifically to buy the reading approach?
In my head, it shouldn't be either or. It should be both. Market access, there's a lot more kind of social interventions that look at that, or a lot of NGOs or gender-focused research or development organizations look at those questions. You know, economic empowerment. How do you get women linked more to markets? How do you get them empowered to make their own decisions? What I like to say, it should be everywhere. You really should be cognizant of gender in any kind of ag research that you do. And so it shouldn't be either or. I do this because I have a background in plant breeding, and I think there's opportunity for change, but it doesn't mean that it's any more important or less important than market.
Yeah, I'm wondering, given the trend towards mechanization in agriculture and adoption of labor-saving technologies, is that, do you think, going to have an impact on gender equity? Right? If we're talking about how labor-intensive a lot of these practices are and their role on women, is this kind of a promising thing for gender equity?
As with anything in gender research, a generalizable answer is not possible. I would say it's case by case. In some cases, if the technology is developed very intentionally with women in mind, yes. There are, by and large, they're what we call gender blind. They assume that there's no difference and people are people. I don't know, examples of a treadle pump. The treadle pump example is really famous, where they brought these pumps where I think you just kind of stand on it to pump water, and they kind of released it out into the world and no one was using them, and they found out that, or was it a bicycle? Anyway, whatever mechanism was used to pump the water out of the well was not socially acceptable for women to be doing those movements. Failed massively, millions of dollars of investment. And that's not a mechanization question, but just to show that not thinking this through properly, it's a lot of money that just goes down the drain. Mechanization in Cassava is what I know best. There are potentially negative benefits. What happens is women provide a lot of the labor for processing in Cassava. Now we have this argument all the time. In mechanization, you save labor. Do you save women labor, or do you displace their work possibilities? It's a complex question. It's not easy to say, in shortcutting the labor question, I'm actually benefiting women, because if someone hires less women, some women are out of a job. So you have to be really careful. I think, especially for mechanization, before you do anything, you need to understand where you're working and what are the issues and work around that. So there's no simple answer. Potentially, yes, I would say.
Looking at that, how do you deal was geographic, spatial, cultural, ratings. So if you release, you know, a specific tool or presentation piece, and you know that it's being positively, you think of was a bit limited in one area, but if they positive, they actually have made it. Maybe a little bit to say that.
I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, you can't parse it down to the individual impact level, right? You have to have some generalizable trajectories that you can, I mean, that kind of axis of do no harm versus impacts, if you're kind of in the middle of you're not doing any harm at least, and maybe you're having impact on some people, maybe that's where we start. And then the more you understand, and it's all about impact assessment, right? You try an iteration, you go out and see what happens, you improve it, you go out and see what happens again, you improve it, you go. So through cycles of improvement, you can get, I think, to impacting more people, but not in one golden bullet. I think that's difficult. Silver bullet.
In the WARE program that you're doing in Uganda, I didn't catch the distribution of various types of scientists.
They're mostly plant breeders from the biophysical and some agronomists, entomologists, pathologists, mostly crop improvement. The social scientists, I would say majority are ag economists, because I failed to mention that we train people from national ag research institutions. And in most, by and large in Africa, the social scientists in those institutions are economists, because impact assessment is big. Not a lot of people hire, you know, rural sociologists or anthropologists because they don't see the value of those research. That's just the cold hard truth, probably. So a lot of the people that come with social science and are economists, I would say. So it's 50-50.
Okay. So within the reading and science part, so you know, why aren't there more non-scientific? Because I love your idea.
Good question.
I think the whole program is a great idea. What I still keep seeing is, you know, the emphasis is on the plant breeding. Right. And so there's so many in my college, I know so much for soil science, entomologists, etc.
This is, you want the on record or off the record answer? It's donor prioritization. When a donor gives you funds and they say, here's where I see the niche, where you should focus, there's enough going on over there, you kind of stick to that. And that's where we've siloed ourselves into the space, because that's where the greatest need was to seem to be. But having said that, the team at Makarani now is at such a point they're just going after what they see interesting, because the capacity building part of it, where the curriculum is developed, the trainers are trained, they can now go chase whatever they want. So that's a great point to be at, because now if there is a group in soil science or climate change or whatever other topic, they can provide targeted services. So that's the point we're trying to get to at the end of it. They're now traveling to other institutions to give like on-site training.
How are they sustaining this?
Over time. Like we had a project commission us for gender training. Two trainers go there, deliver training, come back. Because it's regional, it's relatively cost effective rather than having a Cornell faculty fly halfway across the world. So it works pretty well. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like in a similar vein, like funding things. Do you think that it could be sustainable? Maybe not exactly for this particular program, but to use like social enterprise or something like that, where you can have different sources of funding so that you can enter different places without having to.
Yeah, I think the entry point to that is first you have to establish yourself, and then you kind of move into other arenas, right? Like I said, now it's mostly projects or programs who approach us and say, hey, I hear this is good, can you come and train my people? And that's still at institution or project level. So there has to be some funding behind it to drive that. And that's still an issue, because gender, even though a lot of people pay lip service, when it comes down to the budget, there's not a lot there. So it's still an issue, but that's changing as well. It's kind of a golden second peak. I was talking to someone recently of, in the 90s, there was an era where participation was really important and participatory research was important. And so gender was kind of a part of that. That died a horrible death in the 2000s, and now it's coming back. The donors are really pushing for a gender strategy and gender inclusion. So there's opportunity to do more.
Thank you very much.
Hi. I've always wondered. Are you the fastest?
Oh,